Our next speaker is Mark Maloy. He is a historian currently working for the National Park Service in Virginia. He is the author of Victory or Death, The Battle of Trenton and Princeton, December 25th, 1776, January 3rd, 1777. One of the inaugural volumes in the Emerging Rev War book series. He holds an undergraduate degree in history from the College of William and Mary and a graduate degree in history from George Mason University. He has worked at numerous public history sites and archaeological digs for the past 15 years and is an avid Revolutionary War reenactor. I'm super looking forward to Drunk Hessians and Other Myths of the 10 Critical Days. And everyone get close to your computer because this is an interactive session. So watch out for some fun things to pop up on your screen. So with that, I'm going to pass it off to Mark.
All right. Can you hear me, Liz?
Yep, we're good.
All right. Excellent. Well, thank you, everybody, for joining me here today. And yeah, like Liz said, I figured, well, hindsight is 2020. If only we push this symposium a few months back, we might actually have been able to do it in person, but that's fine because we are doing it virtually. I figure this might actually be a great opportunity to get a little interaction between you all in the audience and myself. And I wrote a book about battles of Trenton and Princeton, part of the 10 Crucial Days campaign, 1776, 1777. And when we originally talking about highlighting myths of the revolution, and as I started looking through many of the myths and stories of this critical campaign, what I found amazing was looking through them is that many of the things that I considered myths or fictions that had kind of been brought up over the years were in fact actually facts. They were true. Some of these things actually happened, and we have written evidence from people from the time period writing about some of these amazing deeds. And so what I'm going to do today is I got 14 of these myths and misconceptions, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to pose them to you all as questions as we get up to them, and then you're going to have the opportunity what we'll do is when I ask a question, you should be able to see something pop up on your screen saying with a question and then an either yes or no answer as far as whether it's true or not. And then the great thing about this is it's anonymous. So, you don't have to feel like you don't know the right answer. You can just kind of say whether you think it's a myth or whether you think it's a true event. And that actually helps me because I can kind of get a better understanding of, what people think is true and what people think isn't true. And I think it'll be a little fun. So, but I'm going to go ahead and let me see if I can share my screen here. So hopefully y'all can see this. So yes, we're going to start off by talking about what I consider. Oh, first of all, let's we're going to be talking about myths and legends, really. So you'll see the definitions here: a myth, a widely held but false belief or idea. So these are things that have been kind of manufactured over the years, and then legends, which are traditional stories, sometimes popularly regarded as historical, but they're unauthenticated. And so these are, some of these things we don't know the answers to because trying to prove a negative can be obviously very difficult. And you see the image there, of course, on the blog post specifically about talking about myths and misconceptions. The Revolutionary War, the founding of America is kind of awash in all sorts of myths and misconceptions, as we're seeing throughout the day today. And the 10 Crucial Days in Trenton and Princeton is really no different. And I'm going to start off by talking about probably the biggest touchstone that anybody has to the campaigns of Trenton and Princeton. And that is this image you see right here. Washington crossing the Delaware by Emanuel Leutze. You have probably seen this in history textbooks. It's on classroom walls. It's if you actually go up to the site where Washington crossed the Delaware River at in Pennsylvania, New Jersey, you'll see it. You'll see actually a full sculpture of it. You'll see it on prints, coffee mugs, driving through the area. You'll see on mailboxes. It's kind of one of the most famous and recognizable images, not just of the American Revolution, but really all of American history. And it really is an amazing painting. And that's going to bring us to our very first myth or misconception. And that's the question of, is this a historically accurate representation of the event of crossing the Delaware? So you all should see a question just pop up. And we're going to give you about 10 seconds here, and go ahead and answer that question. And you can hit submit, and we'll just give it a couple seconds, and we'll see what the results pop up here in just a moment, once we get everybody's input. Wow. Okay. So we just got the results. 94% of you believe this is not an accurate representation. It's only 6% do. Very good. Okay. So you guys are already winning at this game. So yes, this is not a very historically accurate portrayal. And I'll just point out some of the things here. First of all, you'll see this close up here. You see the sun rising. It's a overcast day. Of course, crossing the Delaware happened in the middle of the night. It was snowing, sleeting, raining. It was terrible weather. And so that is obviously incorrect. You'll look at the water here, and you'll see these mini icebergs floating down. This was actually painted by Leutze, who's a German painter. He actually painted it over in Germany. And this actually probably resembles more of what the ice looked like over on the Rhine. In fact, the width of the river in this image is more likely that with the Rhine. On the actual Delaware, it's a little bit flatter ice. Now there was ice in the river at that time, but probably didn't look exactly like this. In the boat, you will see these gentlemen here. You'll notice right behind him an African American. Now there were actual African Americans that took part in this campaign, but Leutze wanted to include an African American. He was actually an abolitionist, and wanted to show the many different types of people who came together in the American cause. You also see this figure who's somewhat androgynous. The idea was to also show, although we don't know of any women who actually participated in the actual campaign, you wanted to show that women supported the American cause during this time period. In the background, you'll see horses and artillery on other boats. Now, this is true. They did cross over 18 pieces of artillery and numerous horses to get over the river. You can imagine what that would have been like on a snowy night. And you also see over on the right some men actually walking on the ice as well. And that is true, too. So at one point, the river does get so frozen over that people would have been able to cross over on foot. Here in the center of the painting, you have this the American flag flying. Now, this version of the American flag wasn't actually adopted until the following summer. And the man you see holding the flag there is supposed to represent Lieutenant James Monroe, the future 5th president of the United States. And you have Washington there in the center. Now, Washington, one of the big things, he wouldn't stand up on a boat going, on a little rowboat going across the river. And that might be true, but, what kind of boats were they actually using? They probably weren't using many of these little rowboats. They would have had large, what they call Durham boats. They were used to actually shuttle coal. They would have been using those to transport many of these soldiers across. And on those boats, many of people would be standing up on those boats because they were so large, and also to squeeze as many guys in these boats as they could. One of the neat little accurate things, the sword you see there hanging off Washington's side, that's an exact replica of the sword that Washington carried later in the war. So that's actually on display at the Smithsonian. But the sword, he didn't actually get this until 1778. So previously at the actual crossing, he had a different sword he was carrying. There's a great book called The Swords of George Washington that shows you that sword still exists, which is pretty amazing, although it is in private hands. So yes, this painting you see is not an accurate, historically accurate representation of the crossing. Now that became, other people are going to try and do images of Washington crossing the Delaware after the extreme success that Loitz's painting had, even immediately. That was painted. This was all painted. That painting was painted in 1850. So you see the men crossing here, Washington on horseback in this painting. Recently, there's actually Mort Kunstler actually did a version to try and get a more historically accurate version. Here he is on a ferry barge, because he crossed at this place called McConkey's Ferry, so he may have crossed over on that. Fact is, we don't have that much information on the actual details of Washington himself crossing, so there's going to be artistic license in all of this. But I will say, although this is not historically accurate, I do think what it does sum up is the critical nature of this campaign. And Loitza was painting this. This is after the revolutions in Europe in 1848, and he was trying to garner support and use the American cause to show how these few men, with the wind beating in their faces, pushed up against all odds and were able to pull victory from the jaws of defeat, and that is accurate. This campaign, the battles of Trenton and Princeton, is going to be a defining moment of the American Revolution, and it was against all odds. And Washington and his band of men were successful. This is probably the lowest ebb of the cause of the Revolution, and Trenton and Princeton is going to kind of turn everything around. So I do think it is still a very valuable representation. It's inspiring, and hopefully gets people to want to learn more about this campaign. My biggest complaint is that this has become so famous that people often think of the crossing, and a lot of people don't know what he did once he got to the other side of the river, and that there were 3 very important battles that had to be won, and Washington was successful in doing that. Now, about this painting, here's another question for you. Okay. Does the first version of this painting hang today in the Metropolitan Museum of Art? Now, you'll see this question pop up for you here. Now, there are many different copies of this painting that have gone around. And like I said, you'll see prints of this all over. There's actually, I think it was Mark Twain who actually said that, this painting became so universal, it's almost in every household across the country in the 19th century. So, here we go. All right. So we got our results. 20% of you believe it is. 80% of you believe it is not. All right. So this is kind of a trick question. So if you go to the Met today, and I'll see if I can switch it over here. If you do go to the Met today, you will see a painting, and it is by Emanuel Leutze, and it was painted in 1851, and it's hanging there today. It's a massive painting. It just steps away, actually, from Gadsby's Tavern's interior that's up there today. This is an original by Leutze, but the one he painted right before this actually is hanging, and we have a photograph of it. It no longer exists. This was the actual original one, and it was over in Germany. It was damaged by a fire, and then it was actually destroyed by Allied bombing during World War II. So the original does not exist anymore, but an original Leutze does hang there in the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And there's a copy of it, the same size, that you'll see on site there at Washington Crossing Park in Pennsylvania. So here's another question, common misconception. Did Washington cross the Delaware River to attack the Hessians on Christmas Eve, 1776? Seems like it should be a pretty no-brainer. I don't know. What do you guys think? I'll let you guys go ahead and answer that. We're gonna be getting close here to talking about drinking and Hessians in just a second, but this is something that I'll often see in many books, all over, that Washington crossed on Christmas Eve. So almost 30% of you said he did. About 75% of you said he did not. And this is a myth. He did not cross on Christmas Eve. He crossed on Christmas Day. And this is often misattributed. And I think it goes to how we celebrate Christmas today. So we often think Christmas Eve, the night before Christmas, is when all the merriment and joy happens. But Washington actually crosses on the night of December 25th, 1776. So when he attacks the Hessians the next day, it's actually December 26th, 1776. So common misconception. Um, Now, this is a good question. Did the weather happen to align perfectly for the American cause during this campaign? Uh, did it support his army almost perfectly? Uh, uh, in finding a way to defeat the Hessians, and then there's going to be a couple more battles against the British in just a few days after the Battle of Trenton. But did the weather just somehow magically happen? Oh, interesting. We are evenly divided on this, 50-50. Well, this is true. The weather almost happens perfectly for the American cause. Now, I know what you're saying. They had to cross in a blizzard. It was snowing, sleeting, raining. How does that help their cause at all? Well, what happens is Washington sets the time to attack. Now, he was going to cross the Delaware, and they had to march 9 miles down to actually attack Trenton. He actually had two other divisions. They were also going to cross the river and attack the Hessians at Trenton. Well, those other two columns can't even get across the river because downriver, the ice builds up so bad they can't even get across. So how does this help the Americans? Well, if those other divisions got across, they may have alerted the Hessians too early and thrown the whole plan off. So the weather actually helps in just keeping Washington's division getting across. The weather was so bad too that the Hessian patrols that usually patrolled the area where Washington's men were crossing, they actually came in. So they weren't patrolling that night because of the weather. And Washington's able to spring this surprise the day after Christmas and totally surprises the Hessians and was able to capture over 900 of them. So the weather actually, that terrible weather helps Washington that night. Then when the British find out about this, General Cornwallis is going to gather up as many British troops as he can to march down and attack Washington's guys at Trenton. Well, guess what? The weather gets so warm that all the frozen roads and everything, they turn to mud. And as Cornwallis's guys are trying to get down to Trenton, their artillery and the men all sink down in this mud and they get bogged down so that they come in too late to Trenton. And when they had the second battle of Trenton, also known as the Battle of Assunpink Creek, they run out of daylight. And so Cornwallis says, we'll bag the old fox in the morning. Well, then what happens is the temperature plummets so deep that all those roads freeze over, and Washington's able to maneuver all of his troops out of Trenton, go around the British flank, and attack his rear guard at Princeton. So it just so happened that the weather is going to actually fall directly in place. It's going to be able to support Washington's troops and slow down the British or drive in their infantry. So really interesting. One of those, that's got to be a myth, but no, that's actually helped the American cause. It's amazing how some of this happens. Just pretty interesting. All right, let's see. Did many of the Continental soldiers lack shoes during this campaign? Now, this is a story that I see constantly. They talk about, barefoot Continentals, not being, lacking proper footwear and all sorts of things. But is this a myth? Is this something that was made up to make the Continentals look more brave than perhaps they actually were? Or do you think this was actually a fact that they were lacking shoes and an important thing? You can see this image of a monument up there at Princeton showing one of the Continentals lacking shoes. All right, so we got about 65% of you say they did, and 35% of you say they did not. This is a fact. Washington's men were terribly undersupplied. And you see it throughout journals, diaries, and all sorts of things of just how many guys were lacking shoes. One of Washington's aides actually writes that you could follow the path of the Continental Army from blood in the snow from the men who lack shoes. Just shows you when I was up, researching this book up in that area in the winter, Anytime it snows, if you take your shoes off and walk around a little bit in snow, I mean, it boggles my mind to understand how these guys went through this, and really also what drove them to do this. It really was a belief in, if whatever their motivations were, it had to be pretty substantial in order to go undergo these kind of privations. One of my favorite stories is the painter Charles Wilson Peale, who actually painted many of the famous portraits of Washington. He was actually a Pennsylvania soldier, and his brother was in a Maryland regiment. Well, he's on the Delaware River, and he's seeing Washington's army come by, and this guy breaks out from the ranks, and he looks bedraggled. His beard is overgrown. He has sores all over his face, and he had no idea who this man was. And it wasn't until the guy started talking to him that Charles realized that this was his actual brother talking to him. And he didn't even recognize him just based on uh, how malnourished and underprovisioned he was. So yeah, the privation of the common continental soldier is no myth. It is an actual fact, and one that is just difficult to comprehend of how they were able to put up with that. Okay, so let's talk about Hessians. Were the Hessians bloodthirsty mercenaries? Now you see the picture here. It's probably one of the most famous Hessians. You probably may or may not know. This is Christopher Walken portraying the headless Hessian from the movie Sleepy Hollow. You can see his teeth are filed down into sharp pieces. But was this the fact? Were these Hessians these kind of monsters? 90% of you say no. Only 10% say yes. And most of you, yes, are correct. These were not bloodthirsty mercenaries. Actually, Hessians isn't the best description for them, because usually Hessians comes from a region in Germany, Hesse Castle, where many of the soldiers came from, but there are many other German troops that are going to come over to America to fight on the side of the Crown forces. And Hessians becomes a popular name for them. Now, these men, you'll see the term mercenary used quite a bit. And they were paid professional soldiers, but a better description of them would be auxiliaries. So they are fighting for their prince, and their prince has been contracted out by the King of England to be sent over to America to fight in this war. And this isn't the only war. These were professional soldiers. They kind of fought all over Europe, and they were renowned as some of the best disciplined, most professional troops in the world. And they come to America, and you can imagine already, I mean, just the cultural difference that these men were German. Many of them didn't speak English. The Grenadiers. Now, all the troops that were at Trenton in 1776 were actually Hessians, and many of them were Grenadiers. So they had these large mitre caps. And if you ever go to a reenactment and see a Trenton or see a Hessian reenactor, you can kind of see how intimidating they look just by, usually they were extremely tall men who already had these large mitre hats. And you can imagine with their reputation as fierce fighters. And there were cases of them taking liberties. At the Battle of New York, the Hessians overrun some of the Americans and bayonet many of the wounded men. And you actually, there's stories that they actually bayoneted some of the riflemen to trees and left their bodies hanging there. And some of these things, yes, there were atrocities committed, but then the stories kind of grow and grow and grow to where there are stories throughout newspapers talking about how the Hessians, like I said, were bloodthirsty, that they ate babies, that they were just these terrible marauders. And the British even, talk about the Hessians penned for looting, and they did do a lot of looting throughout New Jersey. But they weren't these mercenaries that there are actually many Germans on the American side too. And we're going to get into to what happens to many of these Hessians. But it's interesting, after the Battle of Trenton, Washington captured over 900 of these men. And it's an amazing thing because after what happened to some of the men who were killed after they surrendered up in New York, you would think that the Americans could take out their vengeance on these men and put them to death or commit atrocities themselves. But Washington orders no reprisals against these men. And he sends them to Philadelphia, where he has them march through the streets. And people come out to see them because they've heard all these stories about how terrible these guys are. They wanted to see for themselves what these Hessians looked like. And many of them end up in prisoner of war camps in Pennsylvania, Maryland, and Virginia, where they'll sit out waiting for exchange. Let's go to another one. Let's see. And here's a more accurate representation of the Hessians, not the headless Hessian that became so famous after Washington Irving's story. Leading up to the Battle of Trenton, this is a story that's been around for a while, and was there a spy named John Honeyman who infiltrated the Hessians at Trenton and reported all their dispositions to General Washington. So just see if you think that's true or not. You may have heard lots about Washington and spies. Any of you have watched Turn? It becomes a very popular narrative that Washington used many spies. But this particular story, you can see there's a plaque to him actually there in New Jersey for his work as a spy. But was this true? Did this actually happen? All right, so about 70% of you say yes, about 30% say no. So this is a tough one. We don't know for sure. And that's because now proponents of this story, the John Honeyman, the story is that he was a local Tory, that he infiltrated, but his actual heart was with the Patriots. He infiltrated the Hessians. Then he pretended to be captured by the Americans, was brought to Washington. Washington interviews him at night alone, and then Washington leaves him imprisoned with a guard, but the guy, Honeyman, was able to escape, make it back to Trenton, tell Rahl and the Hessians all about his terrible ordeal, and then say, don't worry about Washington. His guys are dying across the river, and they're not going to be able to attack you. Spreads all this misinformation, and then of course the Battle of Trenton happens, and they're all captured. Now, we don't have any evidence from the time period that this actually happened. Now, John Honeyman was a real person, and he was known as a Tory. Now, was he a spy or not? Now, descendants and family histories and tradition says he was, and that's one of the reasons why after the war he's not one of these Tories that's kicked out of the state or his property's confiscated, and he actually does pretty well after. And they say, well, this is because he was a spy, he helped Washington, and so he was rewarded for that. But there is no documentation to back this up. Washington was known as a spy master. He did use many spies to spread misinformation and to gather intelligence. So it very well could be true. This is one of those traditions. Unauthenticated. There's no way we can really prove whether it's true or not. But it's really up to who you believe and whether you think that this was such a secret operation that they were able to keep it secret even 250 years later. But it makes for a great story for sure. All right. The big question: were the Hessians drunk on the morning after Christmas? This is, we've all heard the stories. Hessians were enjoying probably their Hefeweizens and rum and having a good time, totally unprepared. When the Americans hit, they are totally disorganized, hungover and drunk, stumbling around, easy prey for the Americans. And they're able to, my favorite meme is Washington crossing the Delaware. It says, Americans, we will cross the Delaware and kill you in your sleep while you're drunk. We've done it before. But is this true or not? All right, so we got a third of you believe that this is true. 2/3 of you believe it is not true. Now, if you looked at the title of this, it was Drunk Hessians and Other Myths. This is a myth. This was not true. The Hessians were actually quite the opposite. They were professional soldiers. They were under constant attacks from different militia forces, and nearly always on ready for an attack. The night of Christmas, actually, like I said, the snow forced them into forced their pickets in. But they're going to sleep that night with their uniforms on, their muskets ready to go. Now, their officer, Johann Rahl, he was known to have been celebrating that night at the home of a loyalist, Abraham Hunt. And it's likely he had a few drinks that night, but was he drunk or hungover the next day? No. Were they taken by surprise? Yes. There's actually an American fighter, John Greenwood, who writes that he swears afterwards that not a single Hessian was drunk that morning. So where does this story come from? Well, right after this embarrassing defeat for the Crown forces, many of the British are some of the first to say, well, they were a bunch of drunkards. They couldn't handle it. So the story starts spreading almost immediately after the fact. There were Hessians, like I said, they had known for looting. And there were some Hessians, I think, down at Mount Holly. They were actually drinking that night. But at Trenton, no, they were prepared and ready. But Rahl, like I said, they were not drunk though. And then it kind of grows from there to where it's become kind of a common myth about the battle. Let's see, what's the next one? Was Colonel Rahl warned the night before that an attack was coming? Now, you may have heard this story. There's a story that actually, while Washington's men are crossing the Delaware, a loyalist from Pennsylvania makes it over to Trenton, gets a note to Rahl. Rahl has a good hand of cards, so he puts the note in his pocket, doesn't pay attention. Next morning, he's killed in the battle. And as he's dying, he reaches in his pocket, finds the note. If only he read it, he could have prevented this whole disaster. Was that true or not? All right, we're about evenly divided here. 60% of you say yes, 40% say no. So this is kind of was he warned? Yes, he was warned. There was his superiors were telling him to fortify Trenton. They were telling him to get ready for an attack. Rahl, who had performed very ably at the Battle of New York, actually doesn't build any fortifications. He says that he is very overconfident. He says these are a bunch of country clowns. Let them come at me. We'll give them the bayonet. But as far as the story from the note, this story actually doesn't appear until almost over 100 years after the event. One of the first real, what we would consider a history of this event, was written by a man named William Stryker in the 19th century. And he published things like the fact that they were drunk and other traditions that had been passed down orally, and he includes this story. So maybe it was true, but one of the things is Rahl didn't speak English. So unless this farmer, was German and was able to write it down in German and pass it, that's the only way he'd actually be able to read it. And that's really the first documented time that he had this note. But again, it's one of those things. Do you believe it or not? It's up to who you want to believe from history. Did the Crown forces outnumber the Americans in this campaign? Now, this is something, I think Vanessa was talking about the movie The Patriot. Well, we've all seen it. Thousands and thousands of redcoats and Hessians coming at you. Did they outnumber the Americans in this campaign, though? This is something, like I said, that small band of guys going up against across the river to attack the larger force. Is in fact that the case? Were they outnumbered? All right, so we got 2/3 of you think they were outnumbered. Only a third think they were not. Now this is interesting because actually the Americans outnumber the British at almost every engagement during this campaign. Now, Washington did suffer a massive defeat at the Battle of New York just before this campaign. His army in August 1776 was about 24,000 men. As he's retreating across New Jersey that winter, he says he can only count about 3,000 men left. Now, he had by the time he gets across the river and including sick and people who weren't able to fight. He had 6 or 7 thousand guys on the on the southern side of the Delaware River. Now the British outnumbered them, in the Battle of New York. But then what the British do is they leave all these little outposts all across New Jersey, and he only leaves about 1,500 Hessians under Rall there at Trenton. So when Washington divvies up his forces, he's the only guys who get across the river and attack Trenton is 2,400 men. So he's actually going to outnumber the Hessians. He has 2,400 and they have only about 1,500. And Washington brings 18 pieces of artillery, which massively outnumbers the Hessians as well. So in this case, he actually has more numbers. At the Second Battle of Trenton, he has almost even numbers with the British. They're both about 6 or 7,000 men. And then at the Battle of Princeton, he vastly outnumbers the British. He has about 6 or 7,000 guys, and the British only have about 1,500 men. So in each of these events, Washington was able to basically set it up so that his men are in a numerically superior advantage. Now, most of his men don't have as much experience, or they're not as good soldiers often as the well-disciplined, trained Hessians or British. So that's going to affect, how these battles could have played out. But Washington always is trying to be at a numerically superior advantage. Now, during this first battle, did the Continental Army suffer 0 deaths in the Battle of Trenton? Now, this has been, if you watch the movie, The Crossing, right? It's a good movie. It's a TV movie, lots of inaccuracies, but still just kind of shows the crossing and the Battle of Trenton. At the end of the movie, says, "Do we lose anybody?" He says, "No, we didn't lose a single person." And I said, "Is that possible in this battle that took place at Trenton, that nobody on the Continental side died?" All right, so we got 70% of you say no, 30% say yes, and this is true. Nobody on the Continental Army died in the Battle of Trenton. They suffered 0 deaths. There were about 4 or 5 men wounded, one of which you can see there on the right side. That's Lieutenant James Monroe, who was actually wounded in the shoulder, nearly died till a artery was clamped and he was saved. But nobody was actually killed. 2 men, we believe, actually froze to death on the march there. So if you wanted to count those, you could say a couple guys died in the campaign on the way there. Now, the Hessians, they're going to lose about 20 men killed outright, about 80 are wounded, and like I said, over 900 are captured. So a huge disparity and a huge victory for the American cause. Now, what happened to these Hessians? I mentioned how they were paraded through Philadelphia and they end up in prison or war camps, but did nearly all the Hessians go back to Europe after the war was over? We think of expeditionary forces, the United States sends to other places. Majority of the men that you're going to send overseas or whatever are going to be coming back, except those who are killed. But what about the Hessians? Were they eager to head back home to Germany, or do you think some of them stayed over here? So no, yeah, most of you got this right. So 90% of you say no, 10% of you say yes. No, most of them are going to return. So about 60% of them go back, but a large percentage of them are going to end up staying here in the United States. I mentioned there are Germans here in America. Many of them actually like it here, and they're going to basically meld into the population. So a lot of people actually have Hessian ancestors. They don't even know. Actually, I think there was a TV show about Rob Lowe, who actually one of his ancestors is one of the Hessians at Trenton, which is kind of interesting. Okay, we're getting close to the end here. Did George Washington ride up in front of the American troops, come within 30 yards of the British soldiers, and survive unscathed? Now, this is a story I think I read in a kid's book when I was a kid that I thought was awesome. The statue you see here stands in Washington, D.C. at Washington Circle, and it's supposed to show this moment. But was this true? Did Washington actually ride up that close to British soldiers and survive? I'd be interested to see what you guys think. If you think this is part of Washington lore, a myth, or is this in fact truth? Did he actually do this? Okay, so we're about 60% of you say yes, and 40% of you say no. This is, in fact, true. Washington, who's renowned for his ability to expose himself in danger, at the Battle of Princeton, on the battlefield there, the Americans were being overrun. They're being driven back. A couple of artillery pieces are holding off the 17th Regiment of foot. And it looks for a moment like this whole campaign's gonna break down when who rides in? Washington on his horse. He rides right up into the fleeing men. He says, "Parade with us, my brave fellows. There's but a handful of the enemy, and we will have them directly." He rides out and starts leading the men forward, orders a fire, then rides up in between the British and the American lines. And we know this is true. Actually, Alexandrian Colonel John Fitzgerald, who was with Washington at this time, told this story to Washington's adopted grandson, George Washington Parke Custis. He says Washington rode up in between the lines and gave another order to fire. And at this moment, the British leveled their muskets. So Washington's between the lines, both sides open fire. Fitzgerald puts a hat over his eyes so he doesn't see Washington cut down in front of him. He lifts his hat up, the smoke clears, and there's Washington unscathed, riding up and down the lines. And this was repeated throughout the army. There's actually a great letter from a Pennsylvania soldier who wrote to his wife just a few days after and says, "When I saw him brave all the dangers of the field, his important life hanging as it were by a single hair, with 1,000 deaths flying around him, believe me, I thought not of myself." And the Americans are able to level their bayonets, charge forward, and drive the British from the field. And this moment was so important in the Washington story that he almost becomes a hero overnight. And it solidified a bond between Washington and his men there at Princeton, that he was willing to do anything for this cause, and they were willing to follow him anywhere. All right. And so, last question for you. Was this the most significant military campaign in the war? Now, this is partly an opinion piece. I would really hope that you all get a chance and get a copy of my book, Victory or Death. And if you actually go with our publisher, Savas Beatty, you can get 20% off if you order it through them for attending this symposium today. But this is ultimately the crux. How important were these battles? Was this the turning point? Was this the most significant campaign? All right. And so most of you are my friends here. 60% of you say yes, 40% of you say no. I am, of course, biased. I believe this is the most significant event. Like I said, this is the lowest ebb of the American cause. Everything looks like it could be over if Washington is defeated here. If he loses one of these battles, if his army is crushed, if his men desert, there is no George Washington. I am a strong believer there is no United States of America. He's going to prove invaluable in the rest of the War of Independence. He's going to prove invaluable in the creation of this nation. And it was really a crucial moment for him and a crucial moment for the whole country. Of course, we don't know what would happen if these did not happen, but I can say in my book, and you look at historians throughout the 19th, throughout the 20th, throughout the 21st century, they constantly are talking about how significant this is. James McPherson, the Civil War historian, even says this is the most significant campaign in American history. That's a Civil War historian saying that. And I think it's best summed up by a British historian in the 19th century who said, it can be doubted whether so few men in such a short span of time had more lasting or longer effects on the history of the world. And I truly believe that. I think that's why, if you get a chance, one of the things about the book is that it really focuses on the places you can go see today, the parks, the battlefields, the city, stand in the footprints of heroes. If you haven't never been up there, you're in luck. We are doing a tour in November of these battlefields. Check out emergingrevolutionarywar.org. You can sign up, buy a ticket for that. You'll be led by yours truly and Rob Orison to go actually see some of those events. So just a really great place. And I encourage everybody to look more into this campaign because it's fascinating history, to be sure. So at that, I will go ahead and stop sharing my screen. And if we have any questions, I want to make sure everybody gets their full lunch break. So we got 5 minutes. I'll go ahead and turn it over to Liz.
Well, thank you so much, Mark, for that really great presentation. I really appreciated the polls, and that was super fun to play with on the back end.
Yeah.
We have some nice comments in the chat about some experiences at touring the Washington Crossing a few years ago. One of our participants said one of the rangers explained while pointing to the bridge that he likes to ask tourists why Washington didn't use the bridge. He likes to see the reactions from those folks. And then perhaps this will be a conversation for the panel or next year's symposium, but a presentation about the weather and just the impact of the weather throughout the war.
Yeah, no, that's spot on because it's amazing because yeah, just at New York, Washington's army's almost crushed there at Brooklyn, and it just so happens that a fog descends over the East River that hides his men shuttling across the East River. Yeah, weather, it's amazing, and you really see where many of the men who participated in this, including Washington, attribute some of their victories to divine providence. And it's hard reading the actual events and seeing that and saying, in arguing against that. I think it was Stonewall Jackson who said in a different war, he who does not see the hand of God in this is truly blind. And you see something similar to that with the revolution, because yeah, how did this happen that it just so happens that it falls directly in place and helps the American cause along the way? It's hard to argue against divine providence.
And we another note, I believe our maybe spy John Honeywell, his house still is around in Griggstown, New Jersey. So I don't know if that's
Yes.
in your book or not. Um,
It's not in the book, but yeah, no, I'm familiar with that. So that's great.
cool. So we have a question, and feel free again to drop questions in the chat. That's also where a link to Mark's book is, and the code to use if you'd like to purchase it online. It is a signed copy, so make sure you buy that online with your 20% off. So our question is it true that the American soldiers got into the Hessian rum supply and were the ones who may have been drunk?
That is fantastic, and yes, that is true. So yeah, the Americans, yeah, do break into the rum supply, and yeah, there are recorded events from the time period that yeah, some of the American soldiers were getting drunk, and yeah, I mean, you can imagine having not slept all night, crossed an ice-choked Delaware River, marched 9 miles in a blizzard, fought a battle, that they were well entitled to a celebration. But at this moment, this is when Washington also makes the decision to march his army and all the Hessians back 9 miles and cross the Delaware River later that day and get back, because he didn't want his men to, his entire army to get drunk and basically be sitting ducks for the British and the other British and Hessian soldiers there in the area. So yeah, it is kind of interesting that it's almost on top of its head, as to far who was drinking on that Christmas of 1776.
Well, I don't see any more questions in the chat. I know we had someone raise their hand, but if you type in your question in our chat bar, then we'll certainly pass that along. Oh, a good trivia question. How many times Washington crossed the Delaware?
Yeah, yeah, and that's something. Yeah, Washington. Yeah, he crosses the Delaware to go attack. He crosses the Delaware back, and then spends a few days in Pennsylvania, and then yeah, is going to cross again back over to set up. And of course, he crosses Delaware. So yeah, he's going back and forth all the time. And yeah, you can imagine, yeah, and that weather in the middle of December would have been pretty amazing. And then yeah, if you go up to the area today, you also see up nearby are other ferries that Washington's going to cross. In later campaigns when they're going from Valley Forge to attack the British at the Battle of Monmouth more than a year later. So yeah, Washington crosses many rivers, but it's that crossing on Christmas Day that becomes the most important because of the events that followed in the Battle of Trenton and Princeton.
Well, I think one of the questions for our panel in the afternoon that we'll have to drop for Rob and Phil would be you and Vanessa can do a Fight Club over is the Southern campaign or Trenton and Princeton the most important parts of the Revolutionary War. So I look forward to seeing that banter back and forth between what potentially the answer to that question would be.
Yeah. And I got a foot in both things. I'm actually working on a book right now about Charleston, South Carolina, and the Revolution. So I do not discount the importance of the. Well, we'll wait until the panel, but
For the afternoon fun. So unless there's any other questions from our participants out there on the Zoom, then if you can think of one, you can always certainly email me and then we can pass that along to Mark as well to get that answer. But in the meantime, I think we'll end here. So thanks again, Mark, for a really great presentation, and we'll see everyone in about an hour.